Also in Ankara for us, our diplomatic correspondent, Andrew Hopkins. Andrew, thanks very much for joining us. I'll hand it over to you. You have a guest, I believe.
Yes, that's right, Adnan. We're here in Ankara to follow a full day of commemorations for the events that happened back on July the 15th in 2016. And I think it's probably just quickly worth a recap of what actually happened on that night, about how shocking these events actually were, because on that night, Parliament was bombed, 2 police headquarters were bombed, there were explosions all around the presidential complex where we are at the moment. And anybody who has an interest in the country of Turkey will know that there have been coups that have taken place in this country before, but nothing on this scale. What had happened in the past was usually that military officers would go to see the political leaders, tell them that their time was up, they weren't happy with how they are running the country, and that they were then going to be taking over. They've had nothing in Turkey of a coup where more than 250 people were killed and more than 2,000 people were injured. Now, to discuss the events of that night a bit more, I'm now joined by Gulnur Aybet, who's a senior advisor to the Turkish president. Now, Ms. Aybet, I just wanted to ask you, first of all, I believe you were caught up in the events of that evening. Can you tell me about your experience?
Yes, well, I was actually in Istanbul on the night of the 15th of July, and I was actually at a TV studio on the European side because we were doing a program about some terror attacks. And I tried to I left the studio around 10 o'clock, which is apparently around the same time that the pushists took over the bridge, because the bridge is in Istanbul, that's where it started. And of course, we had no idea that this was happening until we actually found ourselves on the bridge. So I can't explain to you the sheer shock and surrealness of actually seeing soldiers on the bridge that I used to commute every day, shouting curfew. And they had actually blocked off the lanes, the 3 lanes, from the Asian side to the European side. But the crossing from the European to the Asian side was open. And the vehicle that I was in, it was moving very, very slowly. And so we could see it quite a lot. It was a very traumatic, I think, 40 minutes of my life that I wasn't sure if we would be able to get off the bridge. The shooting hadn't started yet. The people hadn't come down to the bridge yet. But there were police vehicles on the other side, on the Asian side. So the atmosphere was very tense. And the coup plotters had already erected a barricade just after the toll booths. And they were kneeling down with their rifles pointed to anyone who would try to cross the bridge. So it was pretty obvious that things were very tense, and this was very, very unusual when, like you said, compared to previous coup attempts in this country. And
Did you actually fear for your safety at that time?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. And because I wasn't sure if we would get off the bridge, and the atmosphere was very, very tense. Once we got off the bridge, I couldn't go home for about 2.5 hours because there were roadblocks everywhere erected by the coup plotters. And by this time, of course, the radio was actually announcing that an attempt was underway. And we were hearing reports of tanks running over cars, that some shooting had started in some places. Some of them were not confirmed. So you can imagine that, I was quite worried that we would end up in an area where there were lots of things going on that were very unpleasant. By the time I got home, it was when the president was live on FaceTime, thank God. And I think that, therefore, it must have been around just after midnight. And then from about 2 a.m. onwards, I was on the international media all night, explaining what was going on and getting my information from friends of mine who were already on the streets, from social media and from the television channels that were reporting what was going on. And I was relaying all the information that I had to the foreign media, who were very misinformed, and also some of them were very confused as to what was going on because there wasn't any reporting coming out at that time. So I think my contribution to that night in terms of talking to the international media non-stop until 8 in the morning was quite something as it was all happening. And one of the other things I don't forget is the following day, TRT World were actually doing a special program. So I was asked to come to the studio in the afternoon, and it was about midday that the car came to pick me up, and we went past the bridge. And I mean, amazingly, they had cleared up a lot of what had happened there, but there were empty armored personnel carriers, tanks all over the streets. And to see that in your city gives you such a sense of violation, of being violated, that it's just really something that you cannot describe. And another episode that I never forget is that at one point the car that I was in stopped at some traffic lights just going onto the bridge, and I came into eye contact with a policeman who was coming out of an abandoned tank because they were looking for evidence in the tanks at that point and clearing up all the mess. And when we looked at each other and we waved at each other after, going through what we went through that night, I think the amount of sense of solidarity and emotion that you feel with an utter stranger, that's, again, another feeling that is very difficult to describe.
Here in Turkey now, the finger of blame is firmly pointed at the Gulenist organisation, now known as FETO, a proscribed terrorist organisation. On that night, did you have any idea, any thoughts about who may be behind this coup attempt?
Initially, when I was on the bridge, I couldn't think about such things because, as I said, I was worried for lots of things, and I was like most people on the bridge at that time because I didn't know anything about it until I saw them. So I was in sheer shock. But once I got home and I was talking to the foreign media, I remember as early as 1 a.m. they were asking me, who do you think is behind this? Do you think it's FETO and the Gulenists? And I said, well, who else could it be? So that was the first thing that came to my mind, because this organization had infiltrated the judiciary and the military in a very unprecedented way. So, and there were already trials against them carried out because of the way that they had taken control of the higher echelons of the judiciary. And it was a result of those trials that around more than 3,000 prosecutors and judges were about to be arrested, which is one of the explanations, some say, that brought the coup for them slightly forward. And that's precisely why after the coup there were a large number of arrests, because these cases had already been underway. So because we know that these cases were underway against them for infiltrating state institutions, of course, once I was able to think clearly after the initial shock, that was the first thing that came to my mind, like many other people in this country.
Since that day, you've now become a senior advisor to the president,
Yeah.
and you've met, I imagine, quite a lot of foreign officials, foreign politicians since then. What's been the most difficult thing about trying to explain the events of that night to these people?
I think the initial stages were the worst. For the first 2 months after the 15th of July 2016, because the foreign media were, I think, so blatantly awful in the way they reported it. They deliberately skipped the suffering of the Turkish people that night. They deliberately skipped any of the facts regarding the Gülenist movement and just concentrated on the number of people who had been arrested. And they did not see this as a triumph of democracy. And over and over again, I've mentioned that, there is one picture of Tiananmen Square that's become iconic for the West. There were thousands and thousands of even more iconic pictures from that night that were never shared in the Western media. There were people throwing themselves under tanks, and they were never shared in the Western media. And those people were doing it because they believed in democracy. So I just think that there was a lot of double standards that influenced people in the West, including leaders and politicians, with regards to what happened that night. But I think eventually, as foreign dignitaries and leaders and ministers came to visit Turkey, and particularly visited the parliament, they actually got the idea about what had happened. Because I mean, bombing Parliament, that's a huge thing. And I think, you know, for all the ministers and foreign leaders who visited the Parliament since then, I think they understood what happened that night.
What do you think Turkey would look like now if the coup had actually succeeded?
I think it would have taken not only Turkey but also the whole region back into the Dark Ages. And you know, it's just a miracle and an amazing wonder that it didn't succeed, because they were highly organized. But I think, you know, at the end of the day, it's the miracle of people power that stopped them. I mean, God forbid, if it had succeeded, it would have been absolute and utter chaos. And you know, if there's instability in Turkey, it means it's instability for the whole region.
I mean, now, 3 years after the failed coup attempt, we still see reports in the Turkish media of operations being carried out to arrest people suspected of being a member of FETO, the Gulenist network. How can you explain to people outside this country why these operations are still going on 3 years afterwards? Why haven't the suspects, the people involved, been dealt with already?
Yes, well, like I said, initially it's come in waves, because initially after the coup there were already these ongoing cases filed by many prosecutors against them. So a lot of thousands of people were already about to be arrested before the coup. So that's why immediately after the coup there was the first wave of arrests. And then the Turkish intelligence services discovered this program called Bylock that was loaded onto their telephones of this organization, and it was something that was created just for the use of this organization, so that they could it's an encrypted messaging service that they use themselves. And the server was abroad, and the Turkish intelligence services were able to bring that server here. And then once they unraveled it, of course, the more you unravel more numbers, it reveals more numbers and then more numbers. So that's one thing. And then the recent wave has been the use of coded public telephones that they were using. So they used different methods of communicating, and I think those last two methods that the intelligence services tapped in actually gave them a lot of data, which as it gets processed, you get access to more. And also, let's not forget that there's also a commission that looks into the arrests that happened after the coup. So those people who felt that they were wronged by these arrests have a right to apply to this commission. And since then, people, you know, a number of people have been returned to their jobs who were wrongfully arrested or removed from their jobs. But the judiciary, I think, has been slow in handling some of these cases, because, let's face it, it's the place where the FETO, the Gulenists, were most actively infiltrated into. So after that, you know, it's inevitable with the short staffing that there would be, you know, a sluggishness. And of course, the people who suffered, I think, also from that sluggishness are the victims of that night. The relatives of those who gave their lives for this country have been waiting for justice too. So, but, you know, a lot of the major trials have now concluded. So, I mean, we're pleased to say that we can at least put that behind us. But it's very important, and I have to stress this, that although we put some of the trials behind us, and hopefully the rest of them will follow suit very soon, we must never forget, and we must commemorate that night, because otherwise we would not do justice to all the people who gave this great sacrifice for their country. And right behind me, as you can see, this is the monument of the 15th of July at the presidential complex. And it's very, I think, meaningful that we're starting today's commemoration services at this monument.
Do you think the nature of the coup attempt, the nature of FETO, the Gulenist organisation, how it acts in a very secretive way? You were talking there about the Bylock mobile application. Do you think this has had any effect on the country of Turkey as a whole, in terms of maybe it's becoming more worried about its own security, maybe the political leaders more worried about their security, because these people were very difficult to identify who they are some of the time?
I mean, I think it's just made everybody think in a different way as to the danger and the threat an organization of this scale can cause. And of course, one of our missions is also to keep talking and convincing foreign governments not to give refuge to these people who are also working for, not just within Turkey, but it's an international criminal organization. This has actually made us also more aware of the international efforts that Turkey has to make with regards to combating this threat.
And since the coup attempt actually happened, quite a large number of people have been removed from the judiciary, the military, the bureaucracy, because they are either members of FETO involved in the coup or at least suspected of being a member of FETO. How has Turkey coped with filling those jobs again? Because I imagine it must be quite difficult to try and get people of sort of relevant experience to fill those jobs straight away.
I think the Turkish armed forces of all the institutions you mentioned have been remarkable, because it's only a month after the 15th of July that they started Operation Euphrates Shield in Syria, and they cleared over 2,000 square kilometers from the terrorist organization Daesh, which is more than any member of the coalition against Daesh has done single-handedly. So I think that the Turkish armed forces have coped with that. They have since then undertaken 3 operations. Given that, yes, they have been short-staffed in some areas, but they have made up for those with restructuring and with new recruits. It's the same with the judiciary. I think they were initially impacted because, as we mentioned, there has been a sluggishness in the processing of cases, but I think they are addressing that now with the new judicial reforms that are underway. And also recently, the Digital Transformation Office of the Presidency has launched several regulations that deal with the sluggishness of bureaucracy to streamline things and make it more efficient, expedient and accessible to citizens and businesses. So I think that last one particularly is very important. So it's all about rethinking, reboxing, streamlining and rearranging. And I think Turkey is very good at doing that, because look at how they adapted their institutions after taking in nearly 4 million Syrian refugees.
Ms. Aybet, thank you very much. We'll be here throughout the day here in Ankara, where there's going to be a series of events, the opening of a new memorial here, a special session in Parliament and the opening of a new police headquarters, and then some events in Istanbul as well. So back to you in the studio, Adnan.